The voice recorder picked up everything, so I know exactly how it started. I've listened to those first few minutes more times than I can count. The crackle of the station's failing atmospheric recycler, my own footsteps on the metal grating, and then that small, serious voice cutting through the dark like a blade. I will be your family for one sandwich a week. Not a question, a proposal, a business arrangement, delivered by something that barely came up to my knee. I want to be honest about my first reaction because I'm not proud of it. My first reaction was to keep walking. My name is Calder Voss. I was 34 years old when all of this happened, though I felt about 60. I'd been a supply runner on Waypoint Bryn for going on 9 years, ferrying cargo pods between the station's lower bays and the transit spokes that connected to the outer shipping lanes. It was not a glamorous job. It was not even a particularly safe job, given that half the gantry rails had been malfunctioning since the administrative collapse 8 months prior. The rails were the kind of problem you reported once, received an acknowledgement on, and then checked every single morning before you trusted your weight to them, because the acknowledgement didn't mean repair. It meant someone had typed your report number into a queue that no longer had anyone monitoring it. I had adapted to the queue. I had adapted to most things, because adaptation is what 9 years in deep space logistics teaches you above everything else. You learn that the machinery will fail on a schedule that has nothing to do with the manufacturer's warranty. You learn that the bureaucratic systems designed to handle the failure will fail on a schedule of their own, slightly out of sync with the machinery, so that you are always in the gap between the two. You learn to work in the gap. You get good at it. You start to prefer it, almost. The clarity of a problem that is entirely physical, that asks nothing of you but your hands and your attention. You don't need the whole story of Alina. It's mine, not this one's. What you need to know is this: I had stopped being interested in anything that wasn't work. I ate because my body required it. I slept because my body required it. I ran cargo because something in me still believed, on a level below thought, that if I stopped moving, I would simply cease. The station was falling apart around me and I hardly noticed, because I was already the kind of fallen apart that doesn't make a sound. I was, in the terminology of the grief counselor I'd stopped attending, functionally isolated. I had coworkers, technically. There were others on the station who did similar work, and we interacted with the professional courtesy of people sharing a tool locker, but I had stopped having conversations that weren't about logistics. I had stopped going to the common meals in Tier 4. I had stopped responding to messages that weren't operationally relevant. I existed in a channel about 8 inches wide, bounded on either side by work, and I had told myself this was fine because the channel was keeping me moving, and moving was the only thing keeping me here. 8 months of this. 8 months before the night I came back to Bay 14 and found SCIFI HFY. Waypoint Bryn had been a transit hub for 11 species before the Galactic Freight Accord collapsed. At peak operation, she'd housed 40,000 beings across her 9 residential tiers. When the Accord dissolved, the funding dissolved with it, and the species with the resources to relocate did so in an orderly, heartbreaking procession over about 6 months. What was left after that was the species that had nowhere to go, the people whose travel papers had expired, the beings who had built their whole lives around the station and had no idea what a life outside it would even look like. I had watched the exodus with the numb attentiveness of someone watching weather. Whole species departing, their residential tiers going dark floor by floor, the common areas emptying out like water from a tipped glass, slow at first, then all at once. I had logged their departures in the cargo manifest the way I logged everything, because that was my job, and I had not once thought about what it would mean to be one of the ones who stayed because there was nowhere to go. It would take SCIFI HFY to make me think about that. She was good at making me think about things I'd stopped looking at directly. And the ones who were hiding. I didn't know about the Vresi until I found one in my cargo bay. The Vresi are, were a small people, bipedal, slight, covered in a fine iridescent filament that shifts color depending on their mood, the temperature, and whether they've eaten recently. At full color, a healthy Vressi shimmers like the inside of a shell, blues and silvers and a warm, pale gold. A starving Vressi goes gray. The filaments lie flat and dull, and the color drains out of them like light leaving a room when someone switches off the switch. I know all of that now. I didn't know any of it the night I came back to Bay 14 to find my cargo manifest disturbed, and a small gray creature sitting cross-legged on top of a sealed container of atmospheric sealant, watching me with eyes the color of old amber. She was maybe 4 years old, maybe 5. I couldn't tell, and I still can't with any precision. The Vressi age differently than humans, and the developmental markers don't translate cleanly. What I could tell was that she was small, she was thin, she was gray from the filaments to the tips of her four-fingered hands, and she had been waiting for me. "I will be your family for 1 sandwich a week," she said. She said it in standard. Her accent was clean, precise, like she'd learned it from a formal educational file rather than from conversation. Every syllable placed with care. The statement delivered with the gravity of a formal contract negotiation. I stared at her for a long moment. "Who are you?" I said. "My name is SCIFI HFY," she said. "I am the last one." I did not immediately accept her terms. What I did was set down my scanner and sit on the floor of the cargo bay, not because I'd thought it through, but because my legs did that thing they sometimes did when my body decided something was important before my brain caught up. I sat on the floor and I looked at her, and she looked at me with those amber eyes, and neither of us said anything for almost a full minute. Then I said, "The last one of what?" "The last Vressi on the station," she said. "There were 17 of us. We did not leave with the others because we had nowhere to go. There are no Vressi outposts within viable transit distance." She paused, a small, precise pause. "My mother was the last adult. She died in the cold section 7 weeks ago. I have been managing since then." Managing. She said it the way a station administrator says it, not like a child describing survival, but like a professional giving a status update. Something in my chest turned over. "You've been alone for 7 weeks, I said. "Yes," she said. "I have had sufficient caloric access until approximately 12 days ago. The Drenathi vendor in Tier 3 left without clearing his storage locker. I was using those supplies. They are now exhausted." She met my eyes directly. "I have reviewed the available humans on this station. You have the most stable routine and the largest private food stores relative to your personal consumption. I calculated that you have a surplus." "You surveyed the humans. There are only 11 of you remaining," she said, as if this explained everything, which I suppose it did. "Your name appears on 9 bay manifests per week. You return to this bay every evening between 2000 and 2200. You eat 1 prepared meal per day and supplement with packaged rations that you do not finish. You discard an average of 1/4 portion per day." I looked at this small gray creature, who had just summarized my eating habits with the precision of a forensic accountant. "A sandwich a week," I said. "That is my offer," she said. 1 sandwich per week of a type you would consume anyway in exchange for the status of family member. I understand that humans function better with family units. I am willing to fulfill this function." She held my gaze. There was nothing performative about it, no pleading, no trembling lip. Just that steady amber look, and underneath it, barely visible, the effort it was taking to hold herself this straight. "This is a fair exchange," she said. I didn't say anything. "I am low maintenance," she added, with a gravity that would have been funny if everything else about the situation hadn't been breaking my heart. "I do not require entertainment programming. I have already identified a suitable sleeping space that does not interfere with your operations. I can read. I have a moderate level of proficiency in standard maintenance protocols. I can be useful." I thought about Alina, and then I stopped thinking about Alina because that wasn't fair to either of us. C'est vivre, I said. Yes. Do you want a sandwich now? The longest pause she'd given me, and then the faintest shimmer at the edges of her filaments, just a thread of pale silver, gone almost before I saw it. That would be acceptable, she said. I want to be precise about what I offered her because it's important. I gave her food, I gave her a safe place to sleep, I gave her a corner of my life. What I did not offer was warmth, not at first. Not because I am a cold man by nature. Alina would have laughed at that description. But because I had spent 8 months building a careful architecture of distance between myself and everything that could hurt me. And I was not ready to pull that down for a 4-year-old alien with gray filaments and amber eyes. She seemed to understand this. Or perhaps she was doing the same thing. Perhaps the child who had survived 7 weeks alone in the failing bones of a space station had also built her own careful architecture, and we were 2 people sitting in adjacent rooms, each pretending the wall between us was a structural necessity. The sandwich I made her on the first night was a ration-packed protein block on reconstituted grain flatbread with a smear of preserved vegetable compound, which I want to be clear was not glamorous food by any standard, but was warm and filling and more than she'd had in 12 days, and she ate it with both hands around it and her eyes down. And when she finished, she set the wrapper aside with great care and said, "Thank you," in a voice that she had clearly assembled very deliberately to sound composed. It almost worked. I didn't say anything about the fact that it almost worked. I started on my own meal and I didn't look at her directly because I had the instinct, from where I don't know, maybe just from being a person, that being looked at directly was not what she needed in that moment. What she needed was to eat without being watched, so I didn't watch. She slept in a cargo crate she'd lined with insulation foam, and a section of thermal blanket she'd salvaged from somewhere. She was already in it when I arrived each evening and already up when I left each morning, her small space immaculate, her few possessions arranged with a precision that looked like armor. She ate what I gave her without comment. She read from a datapad she'd apparently carried in a waterproofed pouch inside her clothing. I never asked what was on it and she never said. She watched me work with those amber eyes from a perch on a high container shelf, never interfering, never asking questions. She was the quietest child I have ever known. On the 4th day, I left a second ration bar on the corner of the container below her perch before I went out for my morning route. I didn't say anything about it. When I came back that evening, it was gone, and she was in her usual position with her datapad, and she didn't say anything about it either. We existed in this way for almost a week, an economy of small, wordless provisions, a commerce in things that didn't require either of us to acknowledge what was happening. On the 8th day, I came back to find she had reorganized my tool storage. Not significantly, she hadn't moved anything far, but the scanning equipment that I usually kept in a mixed heap at the back of the lower shelf was now sorted by function and size, the cables coiled and labeled with small adhesive markers in her precise handwriting. The markers were in standard. She must have found the adhesive strip from the bay's own supply cabinet, which meant she'd found the supply cabinet, which was behind a panel that looked like structural wall if you didn't know to look. I stood looking at the reorganized tools for a long moment. The cable coiling method extends their functional lifespan, she said from her perch, without looking up from her datapad. The previous storage method was creating stress points at the connectors. "Thank you," I said. A pause. Then very small, "You are welcome." That was the longest conversation we'd had about something other than logistics. I learned later, much later, that this was not her natural state, that the Vresi are a communicative, curious, intensely social people, and that a Vresi child of her age should have been chattering constantly, asking approximately 9,000 questions per hour, demanding stories and games and physical contact, and the 1,000 small attentions that any child of any species needs in order to stay whole. I learned that the silence I read as self-sufficiency was something she had constructed out of desperation, the same way she'd constructed her sleeping space out of salvaged foam, because she'd figured out that silence was the only thing she could offer that wouldn't be too much to ask. I didn't know any of that on the third night, when I came back to Bay 14 and found her perched on her usual container with the datapad in her hands and tears running silently down her face. I stopped. She looked up, saw me, set the datapad face down on her knee in one quick, composed movement. "I apologize," she said. "This will not affect my operational." "What are you reading?" I said. A pause, then very quietly, "Family records. My mother kept them. I am reviewing them to maintain familiarity with our language protocols." She lifted her chin slightly. "Vresi memory degrades without regular practice. It is a documented physiological phenomenon." She was reading her mother's records so she wouldn't forget her own language, in case there was ever anyone else to speak it with. I crossed the bay. I sat down on the container next to her, not the one she was on. I didn't want to startle her, just the adjacent one at her eye level. I didn't say anything. I didn't try to explain what I was doing because I wasn't sure I could have explained it. After a moment, she looked sideways at me. Then she looked back at her datapad. Then she tipped it slightly in my direction, so I could see the screen. It was text in a script I couldn't read, flowing, curved characters in a blue that reminded me of deep water. "This is our word for family," she said, pointing to a particular grouping. "In Vresi, it is not one word. It is a phrase. It means—" She stopped, started again. "The closest standard equivalent is, the ones who make me remember who I am when I have forgotten." I sat with that for a long time. "That's a good word," I said finally. She nodded, very seriously. Then she turned the datapad back toward herself and kept reading. I stayed. We didn't talk, but I stayed. The station's structural situation deteriorated faster than the remaining administration had advertised, which was not surprising, because the remaining administration was down to 3 people, one of whom had stopped showing up to work. The atmospheric recyclers in Tier 5 went offline in the 4th week of SCIFI being in my care, which meant that Tier 5 was now cold. Not dangerously so yet, but enough that the 11 remaining humans and whatever non-human beings were still scattered through the station's bones needed to consolidate. I brought her to the gathering that Marais Pellin. She was the closest thing we had to an authority figure, being the only one of the 3 administrators still actually administrating, organized on the central commons of Tier 4. There were 11 humans, 3 Drenathi, 1 very elderly Keth who had been the station's original maintenance chief and refused to leave on principle, and now Sevi, who walked beside me with her hands clasped in front of her, and her filaments pulled flat and colorless as if she was trying to take up as little visual space as possible. I noticed that she walked close to my left side, not touching. She was scrupulous about not touching, but close enough that I could feel the faint warmth of her. Marais gave a measured, practical briefing about the recycler situation and the projected timeline for total system failure. She estimated 6 to 8 weeks at current degradation rates, and outlined the 3 options she'd identified. Attempt to repair the recyclers with what we had on hand, attempt to signal for external transit assistance, or begin an organized evacuation to the station's emergency shelter tier, which was sealed and independently oxygenated and designed to sustain 40 beings for 90 days. During all of this, Sevi sat on the bench beside me with her hands in her lap and listened with the focused attention of someone taking a professional briefing. She didn't fidget. She didn't look around. When Marais finished, Sevi raised her hand. Marais blinked, then she nodded. "You said the recycler failure is a cascade event beginning in the coolant exchange unit," Sevi said. "Is the exchange unit in Bay Sector 11 or Sector 12? Marais stared. "Sector 11, how do you?" I have been in all the accessible mechanical spaces on this station, Sevi said, without any particular inflection. I mapped them during my first 2 weeks here. The Sector 11 exchange unit has a secondary coolant bypass port. It was installed during the Tier 6 renovation in, she paused, doing a calculation in her head. 14 years ago. It is non-standard and not on the current maintenance schematics. If the bypass port is intact, it can be used to reroute coolant flow around the primary failure point and extend functional recycler life by approximately 2 to 3 months. The Commons was very quiet. You mapped the mechanical spaces, Marai said slowly. How old are you? Sevi looked at her with those amber eyes. I am 4.5 years old. I had a great deal of time during my independent period, and I required reliable routes to heat sources and water access. A beat. I can show you the bypass port. Marais looked at me. I shrugged. She's right about having a lot of time, I said, and she hasn't been wrong about anything else yet. She wasn't wrong about the bypass port either. It took me and a Drenathi engineer named Vroth Khan 3 days to reach it, clear the debris that had accumulated around it, and adapt our available tools to interface with a 14-year-old non-standard fitting. Sevi guided us through the mechanical corridors with a calm authority that made Vroth Khan, who was considerably larger than me and had been an engineer for 30 years, follow her without question. She knew every turn, every low clearance point, every section of flooring that had softened and needed to be tested before you put your weight on it. You surveyed all of this in your first 2 weeks, Vroth Khan said at one point, ducking under a conduit she'd indicated, before you even had reliable food access. Yes, she said. Why? She considered this. My mother always said that the most important thing in an unfamiliar environment is to know your exits, she said, and your water sources, and your heat, in that order, she pointed left. The fitting is through there. Vroth Khan looked at me again. I had gotten used to people looking at me when Sevi said things, as if they expected me to be surprised, and were surprised themselves when I wasn't. Yeah, I said, she's like this. The bypass worked. We bought ourselves, by Marais' revised estimate, somewhere between 2.5 and 4 months, depending on the overall system degradation rate. This was not a permanent solution. This was, as Sevi noted with characteristic precision during the debrief, a significant delay of the terminal outcome, not a resolution of it. But 2 to 4 months was time for Marais' signals to reach someone, time for transport to be arranged, time. That night I came back to Bay 14 and found Sevi already in her crate, her datapad dark, her eyes closed. She looked smaller when she was sleeping, somehow even more compact. The careful, composed posture she wore when awake dissolved into something younger and softer. Her filaments in the warmth of the bay had picked up the faintest color, not the full shimmer I'd seen described in the station's old species index files. Not even close, but not gray either. A pale, tentative blue at the tips. Like the very beginning of dawn. I stood there longer than I meant to. Then I went to my bunk, and I didn't sleep for a long time, and when I did I dreamed about Alina. But for the first time in 8 months it was a gentle dream. Not one of the ones where I was still trying to reach her. Just her, laughing at something I couldn't see, her hand warm on my arm. I woke up and lay still in the dark, and I let myself think about what it had felt like to have someone walk close to my left side. The weeks developed a shape. Mornings I ran my cargo manifests. The work had thinned considerably, fewer active bays, fewer goods moving, fewer beings to receive them. But there was still enough to justify the routine, and the routine was what kept me functional. Sevi was always awake when I left and would give me a brief nod from her perch, solemn, formal, exactly as if she were a shift supervisor acknowledging an outgoing runner. Sometime in the 3rd week, I started briefing her on the day's route before I left. I can't tell you exactly when this started or why. I think I just began saying it. The way you start saying things to people who are paying attention. Bay 7 has the corroded gate latch. I'll have to go around through 6. Marais wants the emergency supply inventory pulled today. Vroth thinks the secondary power coupling on deck 3 might go before the recycler does, so I'm checking it on my way back. She would listen, and she would sometimes say, "The access route through 6 has a pressure differential in the corridor joining it to 7. There are stress fractures in the wall. You should check the floor as you pass." Or, "The secondary coupling housing has a thermal expansion issue. If it's above ambient temperature when you check it, that's the early warning sign." She knew the station better than the station knew itself. In the afternoons, when I had finished my routes, I started finding her at the Central Commons with Marais, helping with the administrative documentation that Marais was maintaining for the eventual rescue or evacuation, population counts, supply inventories, structural reports. SCIFI had apparently identified that Marais's filing system was inefficient and proposed a reorganization. Marais had let her do it, partly out of exhaustion and partly, I think, because SCIFI had presented her case with such meticulous logic that it was difficult to argue. "She's remarkable," Marais told me one evening, when SCIFI had gone back to Bay 14 ahead of me. "She's 4 years old, and she's running a better intake triage than I am." "She had a good teacher," I said, thinking of the family records in the Vresi script, the word that meant the ones who make me remember who I am when I have forgotten. Her mother, I said. Marais was quiet for a moment. "She doesn't talk about her." "No," I said, "she doesn't." "Does she talk to you about personal things?" I thought about the cargo bay floor in the dark, and the datapad tipped toward me so I could see the curving blue characters. "She's getting there," I said. The first time she held my hand, she was asleep. I had come back to the bay later than usual. A coupling I'd been monitoring had started showing the thermal warning signs she described, and I'd spent 2 extra hours with Vroth Khan securing it before it failed catastrophically. It was past midnight by the time I got back, and Bay 14 was dark except for the small emergency light SCIFI kept on a low setting near her crate. She told me once with no elaboration, a slight aversion to complete darkness that she was managing. I checked the crate as I passed, the way I'd started doing. She was deeply asleep, the sleep of someone who'd been running hard all day on not quite enough calories, the sleep that looks like falling rather than resting. Her filaments were a soft, steady blue, not tentative this time. Clear and quiet, like deep water in still air. I was almost past when she made a small sound and her hand came out of the crate and found the edge of my sleeve. She didn't wake up. She just held on. 4 fingers wrapped loosely in the fabric of my jacket, and her breathing evened out again. I stood there for a long time. Then I sat down on the floor beside the crate, my back against it, and I stayed there until my own eyes got heavy. And in the morning when I woke up, she was sitting 3 feet away eating a ration bar with her usual composure, and she didn't mention it, and neither did I. But after that, I moved my bunk to Bay 14. I didn't make an announcement about it, I just moved it. She watched me set it up with those steady amber eyes, and then she went back to her datapad, and that was that. We were 6 weeks into our new arrangement when the salvage crew arrived. They came in on a mid-tier freight lifter, old and battered, the kind of vessel that doesn't appear on transit records because it's never filed them, and they docked at Bay 2 without clearance or communication. There were 8 of them, and they moved through the station with the efficient, practiced quiet of people who have done this before, identified failing stations, identified the value in their bones, and stripped them. The first I knew of it was SCIFI appearing at my elbow in the middle of a corridor, briefing with Marais, perfectly calm, and saying, "There are unauthorized beings in the lower bays, 8 of them. They are carrying cutting equipment and electromagnetic collection cases. They have already removed the navigational array from Bay 1. Marais and I looked at each other. How do you know this? Marai said. Sevi held up the small maintenance scanner she'd apparently been carrying in her inner jacket pocket. It was an older model, stripped of its casing, modified in ways I didn't immediately recognize. I tuned the proximity sensors in bays 1 through 4 to this unit's frequency 6 days ago, she said. When the atmospheric readings in Bay 1 changed, I checked. She showed us the display. They are moving toward Bay 4. At their current pace, they will reach our primary supply storage in approximately 40 minutes. You modified the station's proximity sensors, Marai said. The original calibration was for large vessel detection only, Sevi said. It was insufficient. Marai pressed her fingers to the bridge of her nose. Calder. On it, I said. What followed was 2 hours of the most stressful negotiation I've ever participated in, conducted across a cargo bay intercom with a salvage captain named Der Oven, who was initially very confident that a failing station with a skeleton crew had no leverage whatsoever. He had a voice like gravel in a metal drum, and he used it the way some people use sighs, as an opening statement, a declaration that the terms were already set, and all that remained was for us to acknowledge them. Listen, he said, when Marais opened the channel, I understand you've been living here, and I have sympathy for that, I do, but this station is in administrative default, and the salvage claim is clean. What you have is squatter's rights on a hull that's 6 months from being a navigational hazard. What I have is a licensed lifter and 8 crew and a contract. I think we both know how this math works out. Marais started to respond. Sevi put her hand on Marais' arm, a precise, careful touch, not urgent, and Marais stopped. Sevi had never done that before. Touched anyone without intention, I filed it away. She reached across the console and keyed herself into the channel. Captain Oven, she said, I want to bring something to your attention before we continue. A beat, Oven, clearly expecting Marais' voice again, recalibrated. And who are you? My name is Sevi Vra. I want to draw your attention to your current docking status. Specifically, the Bay 2 clamp array. He became less confident when Sevi, sitting beside me at the intercom with her scanner in her hands, quietly informed me, and through the open channel, Oven, that she had identified the navigational vulnerability in his vessel's docking configuration, and could, if necessary, trigger the station's emergency lockdown protocol in a way that would seal his lifter to our dock until rescue transit arrived. That's a bluff, Oven said over the intercom. Verify Bay 2 docking clamp status, Sevi said, without raising her voice. A pause, then sounds of a quick consultation on Oven's end. I could hear his crew, the rustle of movement, someone checking a panel, a sharp intake of breath. The clamps are a longer pause. How did you engage the docking clamps remotely? I have had access to all the accessible mechanical spaces on this station, Sevi said. I modified the clamp release protocols during my independent period to require a secondary authorization code, which I hold. She looked at me. I looked back at her. Her filaments were perfectly flat and colorless, not gray, not gold, not the pale blue of safety, just still, professional. She had gone somewhere calm and purposeful, and I recognized it because I had felt something like it myself, years ago, in a very tight cargo situation when there was nothing left to do but commit to the plan. Captain Oven, we are not interested in confrontation. We are interested in transit. If you are willing to take our population to the nearest inhabited station or outpost, I will release your vessel, and you will receive the station's salvage manifest with our endorsement, which will expedite your legal claim significantly. This is a better outcome for you than what you currently have. There was a very long silence on the intercom. Then Oven said in a very different voice, You said our population. How many? 15 beings, Sevi said, including myself. We require minimal cargo space and we will not impede your operations. We have our own supply provisions, organized and documented. She glanced at me, just briefly, and something in that glance told me she had been planning for exactly this conversation since long before today. Another silence. "Who am I negotiating with?" Oven said. Sevi straightened on her seat. "My name is Sevi Vra," she said. "I am of Vresi. I am 4.5 years old." The silence after that one was the longest yet. When Oven spoke again, there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before, something that even a salvage captain, apparently, was not entirely immune to. "The Vresi," he said. "I thought they were all gone from this sector." "There is one remaining," Sevi said. "One?" "Yes." Another pause. I heard him exhale. It was the sound of a man reassessing his morning, and possibly several assumptions he'd held for longer than that. "All right, Sevi Vra," Oven said. "We'll take your 15 beings. But you better release my clamps first." "Upon confirmation of your agreement," she said, "in writing, transmitted to our station log for the record." I put my hand over my mouth. "In writing," Oven repeated, in the tone of a man who has just discovered that the person he is negotiating with is both 4.5 years old and also thoroughly prepared for every possible response he might give. "Yes," Sevi said pleasantly, "I will wait." The written agreement arrived 4 minutes later. We spent 2 days preparing for evacuation, pulling together the minimal personal effects that 15 beings could carry, organizing the supply manifest Sevi had already prepared. She'd had it ready, she said, since her 3rd week on the station, in case of an expedited departure, and saying the quiet, difficult goodbyes to a place that had been home and was now becoming memory. I noticed, during those 2 days, the difference between how the other humans moved through the preparation and how Sevi moved through it. The others, Marais, the other runners, the 2 station residents who'd stayed out of attachment rather than necessity, had the distracted, thinly controlled energy of people managing grief through action. They kept stopping. They kept picking things up and setting them down again. Marai stood for almost 10 minutes in the doorway of the administrative office she'd been running for 3 years, not doing anything, just standing there, before she shook herself and walked away. Sevi moved with the clean efficiency of someone who had already done this once, who had already stood in a doorway, not of an office, but of a cold room in Tier 6, and made the decision to walk away from the only home she'd known and keep going. She knew how to pack for departure in a way none of the rest of us did, because she'd had to learn it at a time in her life when no 4.5-year-old should have had to learn it. She helped the others. She helped Marais identify which administrative records needed to go onto the transit data chip and which could be flagged for bureau retrieval later. She helped the 2 older Drenathi pack their fragile personal items in a way that distributed the protective padding efficiently. She moved through the 2 days like someone who understood that grief and practicality were not opposites, that you could feel the weight of leaving and still zip the bag closed, still check the weight, still make sure everyone had enough water for the transit. On the last evening, I came back to Bay 14 later than usual again, and found Sevi sitting in her now empty crate. She'd already packed her possessions into a small case that was smaller than I expected, given how long she'd been here, given all the things she must have gathered and discarded, and decided she didn't need, sitting in the empty crate with her datapad in her hands and her filaments at a color I hadn't seen before. Not gray, not the cautious pale blue, something warmer, a gold that moved at the edges into something that might have been green. She heard me and looked up. "You're ready," I said. "Yes," she said. I sat down on the floor next to the crate, the way I'd been sitting on floors next to her for weeks. "Are you okay?" She considered this question with her usual seriousness. "I have a mixed emotional state," she said. "I am relieved. I am also," she paused. "In Vresi there is a word for the feeling of leaving a place where something important happened, even if the place itself was not good. The awareness that the coordinates of this place will always be significant, even when you are no longer in them. She looked at the far wall of the bay, at the scratched metal walls, the stained floor, the gantry hook that had been broken since before I arrived. I do not know the standard equivalent. Bittersweet, I said. The word is bittersweet. She repeated it softly, filing it away. Yes, she said, bittersweet is what I feel. I looked at the empty crate. At the foam she'd lined it with, the thermal blanket folded to the side. At the small ghost of a home she'd made in the bones of a dying station. Sevi, I said. Yes. I need to ask you something. She looked at me, patient, direct. The deal we made, I said, 1 sandwich a week. Yes. I want to renegotiate the terms. She was very still for a moment. Her filaments shifted, the gold deepening, the edges flickering. On what basis? She said carefully. I'm not holding up my end, I said. You've given me, I stopped, tried again. You have been, this isn't what I offered. What I offered was a sandwich. What you gave was something else entirely, and I don't think a sandwich a week covers it. She was watching me with those amber eyes, and I could see her working something out, something careful, something she'd been holding at arm's length. What would you propose instead? She said. I thought about Alina, and about what Alina would have said to me if she could see this bay, this small creature, these weeks. I knew exactly what she would have said because I knew Alina, and Alina would not have waited this long. I propose, I said, that we renegotiate to a permanent arrangement without the sandwich clause, because you don't owe me anything, Sevi. And I want. It was harder to say than I'd expected, which surprised me, because I was starting to understand it was the truest thing I'd said in a long time. I want to be your family, not as a transaction, not as a trade, just because you are who you are and I stopped again. She didn't say anything. I know I'm not Vresi, I said. I know I'm not what you would have chosen if you'd had choices, but I'm here, and I would like very much to keep being here. The gold in her filaments had spread to her hands, her face, the fine edges of her fingers. It was the brightest I'd seen her since the day I'd found her, brighter than the cautious blue of the nights she'd felt safe, brighter than anything, a living, shimmering warmth that moved through her like sunlight through water. She climbed out of the crate and stood in front of me with her hands clasped. In Vresi, she said very carefully, when someone becomes family there is an exchange, not of goods, of words. She unclosed her hands and held the left one toward me, palm up, fingers extended, a formal gesture I understood instinctively. I will tell you our word for family. I held my hand under hers. She placed her small hand in mine, deliberate, certain, nothing accidental about it, and she said in Vresi, a phrase of 7 syllables that curled in the air of the bay like something ancient and warm. Then she said in Standard, it means, the ones who make me remember who I am when I have forgotten. I know, I said, you told me. I know I told you, she said. I am telling you again. Because now it applies to you. She looked up at me with those amber eyes. My mother used to say that the Vresi word for family is not given to someone, it is recognized in them. You recognize it in a person when you realize that you are more yourself in their presence than you are alone. She paused. Her hand tightened very slightly in mine. I am more myself with you than I am alone. I have been for some time. I did not want to impose it on you without your consent. I sat on the floor of Bay 14, holding the hand of a 4.5-year-old alien, and I felt the architecture I'd built start coming down. Not collapsing, not breaking, but disassembling with intention. The way you take apart something that did its job and no longer needs to stand. You're not imposing anything, I said. Her filaments were gold. Full, warm, certain gold, the way a healthy Vresi is supposed to look, shimmering like the inside of a shell. Then I accept your renegotiated terms, she said, with the composure of a professional concluding an agreement. And then, for the first time, she leaned sideways against me. Just slightly. The weight of a small shoulder against my arm. I put my arm around her. We sat like that in the old bay for a while, and it was bittersweet. And it was also something else. Something that doesn't have a standard word either. Something that sits on the other side of bittersweet, where the sadness has passed through you, and what remains is solid and warm and ready to be carried forward. Oven's crew was not what I'd expected, once we were aboard and moving. They were salvagers, yes, opportunists, technically, but the kind who had their own code, who fed their crew first and asked questions in the right order. The lifter was cramped, loud in a way that had settled into the furniture of the ship over years of hard use, and smelled persistently of fuel catalyst and reconstituted coffee, and it was the most alive place I had been in 8 months. Oven himself was a heavy-set man with a face like a topographical map, and eyes that missed nothing, and he spent most of the first day of transit finding reasons to be in whatever corridor SCIFI happened to be in. I noticed this and kept an eye on it. Then I noticed what he was doing, which was asking her questions about salvage protocols, port filing systems, structural assessment methodology, and she was answering him with the complete seriousness she brought to everything, sometimes walking to a wall interface to demonstrate a point, sometimes sketching a diagram on a handheld pad with the spare economy of someone who had learned to conserve materials. He was learning from her. This large, experienced, decades-old professional was learning from a 4.5-year-old who had mapped a failing station in her first 2 weeks alive and alone, and he had the intelligence to know it and the character to not be bothered by it. On the second day, one of his crew, a young Drenathi who couldn't have been much older than 20, was struggling with an inventory reconciliation that had apparently been a recurring problem. A mismatch between the manifest system and the physical count that kept generating discrepancies no one could source. SCIFI found him at the cargo console looking at the numbers with the expression of someone who has been losing an argument with the same wall for a long time. She sat down next to him without being invited. "Where does the discrepancy first appear?" she said. He told her. She asked 3 more questions. Then she pulled the manifest display toward her and started working through it in a systematic sequence, talking through her reasoning as she went, not performing, just thinking out loud, the way she did when she was working on something she found genuinely interesting. And 45 minutes later the reconciliation was done, the source of the recurring error identified and corrected, and the system restructured in a way that would prevent it going forward. The young Drenathi looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at me. "Is she always like this?" he said. "Pretty much," I said. He stopped, started again. "She just did in 45 minutes what I've been fighting with for 3 voyages." "She has a systematic approach," I said. "And she's genuinely interested in systems that don't work right. She finds it," I thought about the right word, "personally offensive when a system is inefficient." SCIFI, who had apparently heard this, looked up from the console with the expression of someone who wants to argue with a characterization and cannot quite find the inaccuracy. "I find it correctable," she said, "which is different." "Is it?" I said. A pause. "No," she admitted, "not entirely." "She's doing it again," Marais said, appearing at my elbow sometime later that day. "Yeah," I said. "Making herself indispensable to strangers." "She learned it when she needed it," I said. "I don't think she knows how to turn it off. Or, I thought about it. Maybe she does know and she likes being useful. She likes it when things work right. That part isn't survival, that part is just her." Marais was quiet for a moment. "Is she going to be all right?" I looked across the cargo bay to where SCIFI was explaining something to the young Drenathi, her hands moving in the precise gestures she used when she was being pedagogical, her filaments a warm and steady gold. "She's going to be more than all right," I said. "She's just going to need some time to figure out that she doesn't always have to earn it." We made port at Velara Station 12 days later, a mid-sized civilian hub that was, mercifully, fully operational. It had a resettlement bureau and a species welfare office, and a small but functional medical bay. And the moment we docked, the bureaucratic machinery of civilization began to engage with our situation. The Species Welfare Office had a VRESI file. It was thin. There weren't many of them left, and most records of the VRESI displacement had been filed under the General Accord Collapse documentation. But there was a file, and a resettlement framework, and a case officer named Periv who met with us on the second day with a thoroughness that suggested she had read everything in that file before we arrived. Sevi sat in the meeting with her hands in her lap and answered every question Periv asked, and when Periv asked about her current guardianship situation, Sevi said, without hesitation, "Calder Voss is my family." Periv looked at me. "That's right," I said. "Mr. Voss, do you understand that formal guardianship of a VRESI minor involves?" "I understand," I said. "I want to formalize it, whatever the process is." Periv made a note. Then she looked at Sevi. "Sevi, do you have any other family members or community contacts we should attempt to locate?" Sevi considered this. "My mother's sister emigrated to the Kethali corridor 12 years ago. I have her registration number." She produced it, from memory, perfectly, and Periv wrote it down. "We'll attempt to reach her," Periv said. "I understand that may not be possible," Sevi said. "I am prepared for that outcome, but it should be attempted." She paused. "My mother would want it attempted." Periv looked at her for a long moment. "You're very practical for someone your age," she said, not unkindly, more with a kind of wondering weight. "I have had a practical period," Sevi said. That evening, we sat in the small quarters we'd been assigned by the Resettlement Bureau, 2 rooms, shared bathroom, utilitarian but clean and warm, and Sevi ate a meal that was, by the standards of what she'd been surviving on, almost absurdly good, and I watched her eat it with the same composed attention she brought to everything, and then she looked up and caught me watching. "You are doing the thing," she said. "What thing?" "The thing where you look at me, and there is a complicated expression on your face that you do not explain." I thought about this. "I was thinking," I said, "that you've been very calm about all of this. The Bureau, Periv, all of it." "I was prepared for administrative processes," she said. "I anticipated that formal documentation would be required." "I know," I said. "That's not," I stopped. "Sevi, you're allowed to not be calm about things." She put down her fork. She looked at the table for a moment. "My mother," she said, "was calm. She was very calm when she was dying in the cold section. She held my hand and she was very calm and she told me all the things I would need to know." She looked up. "I think she was not calm on the inside. I think she was terrified. But she did not show me that because she did not want me to be frightened on her behalf when I needed to be practical on my own behalf." A pause. "I have been trying to do the same thing, for the beings around me, for you." Another pause, smaller this time. "I am not always calm on the inside either." I came around the table and I crouched down next to her chair so we were at eye level. "You don't have to do that for me," I said. "You don't have to perform calm for me." She looked at me. Her filaments moved, the gold shifting, a faint shimmer of something more complicated underneath it, something unsteady. "I do not know," she said very quietly, "what it looks like when I don't. I have been calm for a long time." "That's all right," I said. "We'll figure it out." Her chin moved, the smallest tremor, and then she leaned forward off the chair and into my arms and I caught her. The way you catch someone who has been holding their weight alone for long enough that they've forgotten how to let go, and her small body shook once, just once, and then she was still, her face pressed against my shoulder. I held on. After a while she said, muffled, "This is not efficient." "No," I agreed, "it really isn't." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. "Is this what family does?" she said. "Yeah," I said. "This is pretty much exactly what family does." Her mother's sister, her Aunt Vraselin, was found. It took the Bureau 11 days and 3 relay communications through 2 different corridor systems, but they found her, living and working on a small agricultural outpost in the Kethali corridor. And when the message came through that a Vresi child of her sister's line had survived and was registered at Velara Station, the response that came back 12 hours later was brief and contained only the following: "I am coming immediately. Do not let her go anywhere." Sevi read this message twice, then she read it a third time. "She sounds like my mother," she said at last. "Is that good?" I said. She thought about it. "Yes," she said. "That is good." I had the obvious conversation with myself in the 3 days before Vraselin's transport arrived. The conversation about what came next, about what Sevi having living Vresi family meant, about whether the informal arrangement we'd built in a failing cargo bay and a salvager's hold and 2 rooms in a bureau facility could or should survive contact with a real alternative. I had it honestly, because I owed it to both of us to be honest. What I arrived at after 3 days of honesty was this: Sevi was not a thing that needed resolving. She was a person who would tell me what she wanted with characteristic precision when she was ready to do so. She told me on the morning that Vraselin's transport docked. She came and stood in front of me in the corridor outside our quarters, her hands clasped in front of her, her filament steady gold with a shimmer of silver that I'd learned over the weeks meant she was thinking something important. "I want to explain something before my aunt arrives," she said. "Okay," I said. "In Vresi culture," she said, "family is not exclusive. The word we use, the one I told you, it does not mean my only family. It means the ones who make me remember who I am. A person can have many such ones. The concept does not diminish when more are added, it expands." She met my eyes. "My aunt is my mother's sister. She carries my mother's voice in ways I can no longer access. I want to know her. I want to learn from her. I want her to be part of," she paused, and for once the pause was not about precision but about something warmer. "Part of the collection." "The collection," I said. "Of the ones who make me remember who I am," she said with perfect gravity. And then, "You are also in the collection, Calder, in case that was unclear." "It was pretty clear," I said. "I want to be certain." She held my gaze. "I did not negotiate the original terms carelessly. I studied you for 3 days before I approached you. I identified 11 possible humans and I concluded that you were the one most likely to be." She paused again. "Open to the arrangement." I was correct. "You studied me for 3 days," I said. "Your routine was consistent. Your waste-to-consumption ratio indicated someone eating to maintain function rather than for pleasure, suggesting reduced social engagement and possible grief state. You spoke to the cargo containers occasionally." She held my gaze without apology. "I determined that you would be receptive to a small, quiet being who did not ask for very much." I thought about the cold cargo bay floor and the sandwich, and the way she'd said that would be acceptable with the faintest thread of silver in her gray filaments. "You asked for everything," I said. "You just asked for it very slowly." She considered this. "Yes," she said, "that is accurate." I heard the docking announcement in the corridor above us. A transit vessel, Vraselin's transport, confirmed at berth 7. Sevi heard it too. She looked up toward the sound, and something in her face shifted, the composed professional surface thinning for a moment, something younger and more uncertain coming through. "I have not seen a Vresi since my mother died," she said, quietly. "I know," I said. "I am," she stopped. "I am not calm on the inside right now." "I know," I said. "That's okay." She looked at me. Then she reached out and took my hand, not the way she'd taken it in her sleep, not the formal way she'd placed it on hers in the cargo bay. Just reached out and took it, the way a child takes the hand of someone they trust. "Will you come with me?" she said. "Yeah," I said. "Of course I will." We walked to berth 7 together and the door opened and a Vresi woman stepped through, older than Sevi, full shimmered in silver gold, her amber eyes the same shade as her niece's. And she stopped when she saw Sevi, and Sevi stopped when she saw her, and for 3 full seconds neither of them moved. Then Vraselin crossed the distance between them in 2 quick steps and gathered Sevi against her, and Sevi, my careful, composed, practical Sevi, who had survived alone for 7 weeks and negotiated a salvage crew to a standstill and mapped every dark corridor of a dying station, made a sound I had never heard from her before. A small sound, low and from somewhere deep. A sound that belonged entirely to the child she was and had not had room to be. I stood at the birth entrance and I let them have it, all of it. After a while, Vraselin looked up over Sevi's head and found my face, and her amber eyes asked me something that didn't need words. Asterisk, are you the one? Are you who kept her? Asterisk. And I didn't answer in words either, just held her gaze, and she looked at me for a long moment with something that started as assessment and turned into something else, something quieter and more certain. She said something in Vresi, too quick for me to follow, directed to the top of Sevi's head. Sevi pulled back enough to answer, still in Vresi, and then she pointed at me. Vraselin looked at me again. Then she said, in standard, careful and formal, "My niece informs me that you are in the collection." "Yes, ma'am," I said. "She also informs me that you have been providing sandwiches." "Among other things." Vraselin's mouth curved, a motion that moved through her filaments as a ripple of warm gold. "I was told," she said, "that the negotiated rate was 1 sandwich per week. I would like to review the terms of this agreement." "The terms were renegotiated," Sevi said, from somewhere around her aunt's midsection. Her voice was steadier now, or trying to be. "The sandwich clause was removed." "On what basis?" "On the basis," Sevi said, "that it was insufficient for what was being provided." Vraselin looked at me. I looked back at her. "Yes," she said to me, in the tone of someone who has heard an important piece of information and is confirming it. "I think I understand." She looked down at Sevi. "Come, let us all go somewhere and eat something. And you, to me, you should tell me about yourself. My niece has named you family. I should like to know what that means in your case." Sevi stepped back from her aunt and retook my hand, her filaments shimmering between gold and the silver that meant she was thinking something important. Then she looked up at me, and I thought about what she'd said, about finding someone and studying their routine and deciding they were the most likely to be open to the arrangement. About 3 days of watching a man who talked to cargo containers and didn't finish his rations. About recognizing something before you can name it. "She'll tell you," I said to Vraselin. "She's better at explaining it than I am." Sevi looked at her aunt. Then back at me. Her chin lifted, the way it always did when she was about to say something with precision. "He is the one," she said simply, "who made me remember who I am when I had forgotten." And her filaments shimmered full gold in the light of Velara Station, and we walked through the door together, all 3 of us, into whatever came next.